Imagine a young girl, the adopted daughter of one of Africa's most daring leaders, facing cruelty no child should endure. What happens when her tormentors push too far? You won't believe the shocking turn her story takes. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because this is a tale of resilience, courage, and a father's unwavering love that will inspire you like never before. This is the story of how they bullied Ibrahim Traoré's daughter, and how the world paid for underestimating her. The schoolyard was supposed to be a place of laughter, a place where children could run free beneath the scorching Sahel sun, where dusty footballs rolled across cracked concrete and voices rose like music against the wind. But for one girl, the daughter of a man who carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, the schoolyard became a silent battlefield. She was only a child, yet already the world had chosen her as a target. Her crime was not what she had done, but who she was. The adopted daughter of Ibrahim Traoré, a man both feared and revered. It began quietly. Whispers, giggles behind cupped hands. The way desks were pulled away when she walked into a classroom, as if she carried a sickness. Her books, carefully stacked each morning, were found torn, their pages missing. Teachers, who should have been her shield, looked the other way. For children can be cruel, but what lingered in those corridors was something more sinister, something rehearsed. The cruelty seemed sharpened, deliberate, as if guided by an invisible hand. She tried to hide the bruises of the heart. She smiled when her father came home late, dust on his uniform, exhaustion in his eyes. He had no time for bedtime stories. He was writing one for an entire continent. She carried her pain in silence, swallowing it like bitter medicine, because she knew his burdens were already unbearable. And so the torment continued, day after day, the little girl's laughter fading until it was replaced by a hollow stare that even her father could not ignore. Outside those school gates, Burkina Faso was bleeding. Food was scarce, villages fell silent from hunger, and the shadow of foreign powers pressed heavily on the nation's chest. The people looked to Ibrahim Traoré as a savior, a leader who dared to defy giants, who spoke the name of Sankara not as a memory, but as a promise reborn. Yet within the heart of his own home, his daughter was fighting a quieter, lonelier war, and no one saw her wounds, except the few who caused them. The bullying deepened, evolving from cruel words into orchestrated humiliation. Notes slipped into her locker with threats no child should ever read. Shoes stolen, her lunch tossed into the dirt. When she tried to speak up, her voice was drowned by laughter. Teachers scolded her for making trouble. Other parents whispered that she thought she was above the rest because of her father. And slowly she began to believe them. She began to wonder if she truly belonged anywhere. But Ibrahim Traoré was not a man who missed patterns. He lived in a world where betrayal was never far, where enemies plotted in silence, where shadows whispered louder than speeches. And soon, he began to suspect that what was happening to his daughter was not the randomness of childhood cruelty. No, this was something else. Something colder, more calculated. Behind the doors of elite households, resentment brewed. To them, Traoré was a usurper, a man too young, too daring, too reckless to be entrusted with power. They feared him not for what he had already done, but for what he might yet inspire. And what better way to break a man than through the softest corner of his heart? What better way to remind him that no fortress is impregnable, no leader untouchable, than by reaching for his child? And so whispers became rumors, rumors became campaigns. The daughter was mocked not only for her origins, but for the questions surrounding them. Some children taunted her, calling her the outsider, the mistake. Their words were knives, planted in little mouths by parents who hated her father. And each word chipped away at the innocence of a child who never chose this life. Weeks passed. The girl withdrew further into herself, her footsteps slower, her shoulders bent beneath invisible weight. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant echoes of her father's meetings, heavy voices speaking of sanctions, of betrayal, of hungry mouths and dying fields. She thought of telling him, of unburdening her heart. But every time she looked into his eyes, she saw the struggle of a man carrying a continent, and she decided her pain was too small, too selfish, to add to his load. Yet pain has a way of seeping through silence. It leaves traces in the way a child avoids mirrors, in the way she no longer runs toward her father's embrace, in the way she stops singing. And Ibrahim Traoré noticed. He noticed the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her laughter was no longer light but forced, the way she shrank at the mention of school. A leader must see what others do not. And so he began to piece it together. Whispers from trusted allies, reports of unusual behavior in the school, teachers who had been approached by influential parents. Slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. The torment of his daughter was not accidental. It was a weapon. She had become the battlefield in a war far larger than herself. But for now, the little girl bore it all. She bore it in silence, because she was her father's daughter, and she had learned early that strength was not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry it. What she did not yet know was that her suffering was about to ignite something far greater than herself. For the cruelty of children, sharpened by the malice of adults, was about to awaken a storm none of them could contain. And as dusk fell on Ouagadougou, and the call to prayer echoed across the rooftops, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office, a single photograph of his daughter before him. In the stillness of that night he understood. They had struck at his blood, at his heart, and by doing so, they had made a mistake that would change everything. The girl's story did not begin in the schoolyard where laughter turned to knives. It began in the ruins of a forgotten village where hunger had silenced too many voices. She was born into dust and despair, into a world where the graves of children outnumbered the classrooms. Her earliest memories were not of toys or songs, but of watching her mother's frame grow thinner each season, of nights when there was no firewood to chase away the cold. And then one day she was left with nothing. Hunger claimed her parents, leaving her alone in a hut where silence weighed heavier than the air. That was when Ibrahim Traoré crossed her path. He was not yet the symbol of defiance he would become, but already a man with eyes sharpened by purpose. He found her during a visit to a region scarred by drought, where hollow-eyed children gathered around trucks of grain as if they were witnessing miracles. She stood apart from the others, not begging, not crying, only staring into the horizon with a defiance too large for her frail body. He asked her name and she did not answer. He asked again, and she whispered something so softly that he almost believed she had no voice. But there was strength in that whisper, the same quiet strength he carried within himself. He took her in, not out of charity but conviction. A nation, he once said, is judged not by the monuments it builds, but by the children it saves. And so she became his daughter, not by blood, but by choice, by an oath deeper than ancestry. To him, she was proof that Burkina Faso could heal its wounds. To her, he was the father the world had stolen and returned in another form. But love cannot erase scars. The other children saw her difference. They saw the way she arrived in simple clothes, not the polished uniforms of the elite. They heard the rumors whispered in their homes, that she was not truly his, that she was a child of the poor raised above her station. Some resented her, some envied her, and in a place where innocence should have lived, cruelty found fertile soil. The school itself was no sanctuary. Once it had been a place of promise, built on Sankara's vision of education for all. Walls painted in bright colors, a library stocked with donated books. But time had stripped it bare. Roofs leaked during the rains, chalk was scarce, and teachers struggled to feed their own families. Into this vacuum, corruption had crept. Wealthy parents whispered into the ears of administrators, shaping policies and punishments, deciding futures with folded bills. The daughter of Ibrahim Traoré walked into this broken system every morning, her back straight, her silence heavy. But each day, the system conspired to break her a little more. Whispers became insults, insults became isolation. She would find herself sitting alone at lunch, her tray untouched, while others laughed in groups. They mocked her origins, twisting them into cruel jokes. They told her she was not a real daughter, just a project her father had taken in to look noble. And though she tried to ignore them, the words sank deep, cutting through the fragile confidence she carried. At home, she remained silent. She would sit near the window at night, staring at the stars, while her father buried himself in papers and maps. He was consumed with defending his nation from pressures far larger than any schoolyard. Sanctions that strangled the economy, threats whispered by foreign envoys, the constant balancing act of keeping generals loyal while resisting foreign influence. He thought she was safe behind the walls of their home, untouched by the chaos outside. He was wrong. The truth was that enemies had found a new battlefield. They knew Traoré was a soldier who could withstand bullets, a leader who could face down sanctions, a man who could survive isolation. But what about the father who carried a child in his arms? What about the man who whispered promises of safety to a girl who had already lost everything once before? To strike at him, they did not need armies. They only needed children, guided by parents who carried grudges and fears, and so the campaign deepened. There were whispers that spread like wildfire, that the girl's presence in the presidential household was a cover-up, that she was not truly orphaned, but the child of someone disgraced, that she carried secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Children repeated what they heard at dinner tables, not knowing they were weapons in a war they did not understand. The girl endured it silently, though each word left invisible bruises. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the suffering mirrored hers. Mothers sold trinkets on dusty roadsides. Fathers worked from dawn to dusk only to bring home a loaf of bread. The weight of the world pressed on ordinary people, just as it pressed on her young shoulders. Hunger was a bully, too, and it left scars no teacher could see. The cruelty of her classmates was but a reflection of the cruelty her nation faced, one born of power, manipulation, and the desperation of the weak. But silence has a breaking point. One evening, Traoré returned home earlier than usual. He found her in her room, papers scattered, tears staining the pages of a notebook. She tried to hide it, but he picked up the book and read the words she had scrawled in shaky handwriting. Why don't I belong? Why did he choose me if I was never meant to be enough? In that moment, Ibrahim Traoré was no president. He was no revolutionary. He was only a father, standing before the fragility of a child who had carried her pain alone for too long. And he understood then that the war he was fighting was not only in dusty battlefields or international boardrooms. It was inside classrooms. It was inside his home. That night, as he walked the halls of the presidential residence, the weight of his choices pressed heavier than ever. His daughter had been marked not for who she was, but for who he was. And the enemies who dared to reach through the innocence of childhood had underestimated something. They had touched the one place where he was most vulnerable. They had given him not just a reason to fight for a nation, but a reason to fight as a father. The days that followed grew darker. The bullying did not stop. In fact, it intensified. Broken shoes, threats carved into her desk, laughter that echoed like knives. Yet there was a shift within her too. For though she was bruised, she was also her father's daughter. She carried his defiance in her blood, his silence in her steps, his fire in her eyes. And slowly, something inside her began to change. Her suffering was no longer just her own. It had become part of something greater. A storm was gathering, though no one could see it yet. A storm that would begin in a schoolyard, but would not stop until it shook the entire nation. The mornings became heavier, as though the sun itself refused to rise on her behalf. She walked to school with her head bowed, each step slower than the last, as if her shoes were weighed with stones. The gates that once welcomed her with the chatter of children now loomed like prison bars. The laughter inside was no longer innocent. It was sharpened, rehearsed, echoing down the corridors with venom. Her notebooks disappeared. Her assignments were defaced with crude sketches mocking her father. A small cut appeared on her arm one day, the mark of a shove against rusted metal, and though she said she had fallen, her eyes betrayed a truth too heavy to voice. The cruelty was no longer spontaneous. It was organized, deliberate, methodical. A group of students had formed a circle around her pain, tightening it each day, squeezing the breath from her childhood. Yet children are mirrors of the homes they come from. Their words were not born in the playground. They were born in dining rooms, whispered by parents who despised the man who led their nation. It was no accident that those who tormented her were the children of elites. of businessmen who had lost contracts, of politicians who had lost influence, of families who saw Ibrahim Traoré not as a leader, but as a thief of their privilege. Traoré's suspicion hardened into certainty. His daughter's suffering was not an isolated cruelty of children, but a campaign, quiet, vicious, and strategic. He had faced rebel attacks. He had stared down foreign envoys. He had withstood isolation from powerful nations. But nothing cut as deep as this, a battlefield where the weapons were whispers, and the casualty was his child. Reports reached him in fragments. A loyal soldier whose niece attended the same school spoke of whispered instructions from teachers to let things be. A driver overheard parents boasting at a private gathering about how the girl would break soon. Even scraps of graffiti appeared near the schoolyard walls. Words twisted into insults that tied her identity to her father's defiance. All of it pointed to one chilling truth. This was no mere bullying. This was an attack on the symbol of Ibrahim Traoré himself. Meanwhile, the girl's spirit frayed. She stopped eating at lunch. She tore pages from her notebook, scribbling words she never showed. At night, she dreamt of being chased down endless hallways where every door slammed shut. The pain was more than emotional. It seeped into her very sense of belonging. She began to wonder if she was cursed, a child meant only to lose, first her parents, now her innocence. But suffering has a way of forging steel. And in the quiet of her despair, something small but unbreakable began to grow. She began to notice the shadows in her school, the children who also walked alone, the ones mocked for their poverty, the ones who never spoke because no one listened. For the first time, she saw that she was not alone in pain. Her suffering mirrored theirs. Her silence was their silence. And slowly, though her voice trembled, she began to reach out. A stolen piece of bread shared at recess, a comforting hand on a shoulder, a whispered promise that we'll survive this together. From her own ashes, she began to build fragile alliances, yet the storm outside the classroom was intensifying. Burkina Faso was tightening under sanctions, supplies running thinner by the day. In villages, children fainted from hunger in classrooms with empty blackboards. In the capital, protests flared, fueled by whispers of conspiracies and betrayal. Foreign powers watched with interest, waiting for cracks to widen. And in the midst of this national suffering, Traoré's enemies sharpened their blades of manipulation. They believed that if they could break his daughter, they could break his heart. And if they broke his heart, they could weaken the will of the man who stood in their way. One evening, an envelope arrived at the presidential residence. It contained photographs, crude, grainy images of his daughter's belongings scattered in the dirt, her books torn, her locker defaced. No note was needed. The message was clear. It was not only about a child's torment. It was about power. It was about control. It was about showing him that even in his own city, he could not protect what he loved most. The president's rage was silent. He did not shout. He did not curse. He sat at his desk, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the images. In the silence of that night, the walls of his office seemed to close in. He had expected betrayal from generals, threats from abroad, pressure from banks. He had prepared for soldiers and rebels, for war and famine, but he had not prepared for this, for a war fought in classrooms, where the weapons were children and the scars invisible. Days turned into weeks, and the girl's struggle reached its darkest point. She found herself locked in a bathroom stall, her ears ringing with the sound of taunts outside the door. "You don't belong here. You'll never belong." The words echoed like a curse. She pressed her hands to her ears, but they seeped through, drilling into her soul. For a fleeting moment, she thought of giving up, of letting the world swallow her, as it had swallowed her parents. But then, through the blur of tears, she remembered her father's eyes, steady, unyielding, refusing to bow to giants. And she realized something. If he could defy the world, perhaps she could defy this small corner of it. She emerged, her face streaked with tears, but her back straighter than before. She did not fight back with fists or insults. Instead, she carried herself with a silence so heavy that it unsettled those who mocked her. Bullies thrive on fear, but when they are met with quiet defiance, their power begins to crack. She began to walk differently, to meet their eyes without flinching. And though they continued their cruelty, something in their laughter faltered. For they sensed that she was no longer a victim, but something else. A spark of resistance they had not anticipated, yet resistance alone could not shield her. The campaign against her deepened, fueled by adults who saw in her the chance to wound her father. Rumors escalated beyond the school, spilling into newspapers, whispered in markets, spread on radio waves. Questions were raised about her origins, her legitimacy, her very place in Traoré's household. It was no longer a child's torment. It had become a national spectacle, a shadow war disguised as gossip. And through it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the precipice of an impossible choice. To ignore it was to allow his daughter's suffering to fester, to risk breaking the fragile spirit of a child who had already lost so much. To confront it was to reveal weakness, to show the world that his enemies had found a way to reach him. He was trapped between the duties of a leader and the instincts of a father. The weight of that choice bore down on him as heavily as the fate of his nation. He had faced assassins with steady hands, spoken against global powers with unwavering voice. But as he looked into the hollow eyes of his daughter, he found himself facing the greatest battle of his life, one not fought with guns or speeches, but with the heart of a father against the cruelty of the world. The stage was set. What began as a schoolyard cruelty was now a symbol of something far greater, a struggle between innocence and corruption, between silence and defiance, between a man's enemies and the only family he had chosen for himself. The storm that had gathered in whispers was about to break. The first rays of dawn painted Ouagadougou in muted gold, a fragile promise over a city weighed down by whispers and secrets. Inside the presidential residence, Ibrahim Traoré paced, the envelope of photographs clutched tightly in his hand. Each image was a reminder, a symbol of the cruelty inflicted on the one person he could never afford to lose. The child who had endured so much, the girl who had learned to carry pain quietly, had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that reached far beyond her school. It was time to uncover the truth. Every whispered rumor, every orchestrated humiliation, every subtle betrayal in the corridors of power led back to one source. A network of adults who had long sought to undermine him. Parents, educators, and political allies turned enemies had used children as pawns, believing they could wound the father by breaking the child. They had miscalculated. The revelation came slowly, in fragments. A teacher caught speaking to a wealthy parent in hushed tones. Phone records showing coordinated messages among families. Security reports revealing patterns in harassment. And then came the letters, unsigned, left in locations only the girl herself would visit. They confirmed what Traoré had feared. The bullying was deliberate, planned, and designed to destabilize him. But the moment of confrontation was not in an office or courtroom. It was in the school itself, in the place where innocence was meant to bloom. Traoré arrived silently, not as a soldier or president, but as a father with the weight of a nation's respect and a child's trust in his hands. Teachers and parents noticed his presence, their whispers ceasing. Children paused mid-laughter, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. The atmosphere was thick, electric, charged with the anticipation of truth unmasking itself. He walked beside his daughter, her small hand gripping his with a strength she had borrowed from him over the years. In every step, she felt the certainty that the world had shifted, that no longer would she be alone. And as the leaders of the bullying network assembled, parents who had thought themselves untouchable, administrators who had cloaked cruelty in authority, they understood that the game had ended. The confrontation was deliberate, silent, and piercing. Traoré revealed evidence, photographs, letters, recordings. Each document, each proof, was a hammer striking down the walls of lies and manipulation. Faces paled, smiles faltered. Authority crumbled under the weight of truth. For the first time, the adults who had plotted in shadows realized they were powerless against the combined resolve of a father and his daughter. The girl watched it all unfold, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and awe. The torment she had endured for months, the isolation, the whispered attacks, had led to this moment, a reckoning she had never imagined. She saw her father not just as a leader, not just as a revolutionary, but as a man capable of confronting darkness directly, of wielding truth as a weapon. And within her, something ignited. Her first act of defiance was subtle, yet monumental. She walked forward, her gaze steady, her posture unyielding. No longer would she shrink from the world's cruelty. No longer would she allow whispers and fear to dictate her place in life. Her presence alone was a declaration. She belonged, and she would no longer be invisible. The network attempted excuses, rationalizations, deflections, but nothing could hide the truth. Each lie collapsed under the evidence. Each justification cracked under the weight of exposure. And as the revelations spread through the school and beyond, a silent ripple passed through the city, through the nation, through a continent attuned to symbols of courage and resistance. People began to understand the magnitude of what had been confronted, a microcosm of power struggles, deceit, and corruption laid bare by the courage of one man and his daughter. Traoré's approach was not punitive. It was transformative. He did not humiliate the guilty in front of children. He dismantled the systems that allowed cruelty to thrive. Policies were rewritten, accountability enforced, and safeguards established to protect those most vulnerable. The girl, once a target, now stood at the center of this reformation, a living testament to resilience and justice. As the hours unfolded, what had begun as a personal battle became a public reckoning. Teachers who had turned a blind eye were replaced or retrained. Parents who had fueled hatred were made to confront the consequences of their actions. Their influence diminished. And through it all, the girl's courage inspired others. Students who had been silent, children who had hidden, parents who had despaired, to stand, to speak, and to reclaim the dignity that had been denied them. By the time the sun had fully risen, the atmosphere in Ouagadougou had transformed. Where fear and cruelty had once lurked, hope now seeped in. The girl's journey through torment, the father's unwavering presence, and the exposure of a hidden conspiracy had become a story the nation could not ignore. The people understood, in a visceral way, that power does not only reside in armies or offices, but in the courage to face injustice directly, to protect the innocent, and to confront darkness without flinching. In the quiet of the evening, after the schoolyard had emptied and the city hummed with life, the girl stood beside her father. She was no longer merely a child of circumstance. She was a symbol, a spark that could ignite change. And Ibrahim Traoré, watching her with a mixture of pride and relief, understood that this victory, though won in a classroom, carried the weight of something far greater. It was proof that resilience could shatter cruelty, that innocence could survive, and that even the smallest of voices could resound across a nation when guided by courage and conviction. From that day forward, the girl carried herself differently. The whispers that once haunted her were replaced with respect, admiration, and a quiet awe. She had been tested in the harshest ways possible, and she had emerged unbroken. And as news of the confrontation spread beyond the school, reaching communities across Burkina Faso, it became a symbol of hope, that even in darkness, a single act of defiance combined with love and justice could illuminate a path for others. The climax of their ordeal was not a moment of vengeance, but a moment of revelation. A father's determination, a child's courage, and the unmasking of those who sought to corrupt innocence had reshaped the landscape of their world. Where there had been fear, now stood clarity. Where there had been cruelty, now rose the potential for transformation. And above all, the bond between Traoré and his daughter was strengthened, unshakable. A fortress no external power could penetrate in that silent, charged air of accountability. A lesson unfolded. For the powerful, the innocent, and the observer alike, true strength is not measured in the defeat of armies or in the passage of decrees, but in the courage to confront personal injustice, to protect the vulnerable, and to convert suffering into a beacon for change. The girl had survived. She had endured. And in surviving, she had sparked a quiet revolution, one that would ripple through her peers, through the city, and through the nation. Ibrahim Traoré had not only protected his daughter, he had illuminated a path for an entire generation to witness the power of truth, courage, and resilience. The city breathed differently after that day. Where once whispers had slithered through the hallways, spreading fear and doubt, now there was a quiet respect, almost reverence. Children walked taller, their heads no longer bowed under the weight of mockery. Teachers and parents alike, once complicit in silence, began to understand the consequences of neglecting the young, of allowing cruelty to thrive unchecked. And at the center of this transformation stood the girl, no longer merely a victim, but a symbol, a beacon carved from endurance. At home, Ibrahim Traoré observed her with a mixture of pride and tenderness. He had seen her suffer, had watched the pain inflicted upon her by forces beyond comprehension, and yet she had emerged stronger, unbowed, unbroken. The bond between them had deepened, forged not merely in love, but in shared trials, in battles both quiet and harrowing. She had been tested, and in testing had become something greater than herself, a reflection of courage, a testament to resilience. The ripple of her story extended beyond the schoolyard. Across Ouagadougou, news spread of the confrontation, of how a father and daughter had faced hidden cruelty and emerged victorious not through vengeance, but through truth and integrity. Communities that had once tolerated bullying and corruption began to take notice. Parents reconsidered the lessons they imparted to their children. Teachers reevaluated the systems they had allowed to rot. And the children, inspired by the girl's perseverance, began to support one another, forming networks of solidarity that transcended classrooms and neighborhoods. In her own heart, the girl discovered a new power, the ability to transform suffering into purpose. Each step she took through the city streets, each smile shared with peers who had once been strangers, was an act of quiet defiance against the cruelty she had endured. Her laughter, once cautious and rare, began to bloom again, delicate yet uncontainable. And as she walked, she realized that she was no longer defined by the attacks of others, but by the courage she had cultivated within herself. Traoré's influence, already vast as a leader of a nation, was magnified through this intimate triumph. He understood more clearly than ever that leadership was measured not only by policies or military might, but by the ability to protect the vulnerable, to stand unwaveringly for those who could not defend themselves. And in safeguarding his daughter, he had set a precedent, a quiet declaration that cruelty, whether born in corridors of power or playgrounds, would not go unchallenged. Across the nation, parents and educators began to implement changes. Anti-bullying initiatives were established, mentorship programs created, and support networks for children who had long suffered in silence began to flourish. The story of one child's perseverance became a blueprint for broader social transformation, proving that even in a society fraught with challenges, the courage of a single individual could ignite a movement. The girl herself became aware of her impact gradually. She no longer feared her own strength. She understood that her experiences, painful as they had been, held the power to inspire others. Every child who had felt isolated, every young voice silenced by fear, could now look to her story as evidence that survival and triumph were possible. She began to speak quietly at gatherings, offering hope not with rhetoric, but with the unspoken authority of someone who had endured and overcome. Traoré, watching from a distance, felt the weight of relief and hope intermingled. His daughter's transformation was not only personal, it was emblematic. It symbolized the possibility that Burkina Faso itself could rise from cycles of fear and oppression, that courage and integrity could reverberate far beyond the confines of one home, one school, or one city. It was a lesson in resilience that no policy, no speech, no decree could encapsulate so completely. And yet the story did not end with celebrations or applause. There remained the quiet echoes of struggle, the lingering shadows of those who had sought to undermine innocence. But the difference now was that the shadows had been exposed, their power diminished. The girl's courage had reshaped the landscape of influence. The hidden networks that once thrived in secrecy now recoiled in the light of accountability. Where there had been fear, there was clarity. Where there had been cruelty, there was justice, tempered not with vengeance, but with the transformative power of truth. Communities began to gather, inspired by the tale. Teachers shared her story with classrooms, parents recounted it around dinner tables, and children repeated it in whispered confidences that grew into bold declarations of solidarity. The narrative of suffering and endurance became a rallying point, a quiet revolution of empathy and courage. And through it all, the girl walked forward, each step a testament to the fact that survival could bloom into influence, that a single voice, strengthened by love and guided by courage, could echo across the lives of thousands. In the evenings, Traoré would sit with her on the balcony of their home, overlooking the city that had both challenged and shaped them. He spoke little, for words were often unnecessary. They shared a silence heavy with understanding, of pain endured, battles fought, and futures reclaimed. The city below hummed with life, a chorus of hope and renewal, and the girl, once silenced by fear and cruelty, now spoke with action, her resilience, her kindness, her courage. The nation, too, felt the weight of this transformation. Citizens recognized in the story of one child and her father the embodiment of what they could achieve when courage met conviction. The tale spread beyond borders, whispered among neighboring nations, becoming a symbol of how personal trials, when met with integrity and resolve, could spark collective awakening. In every corner where despair once festered, a flicker of hope ignited, and in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the city was bathed in the warm glow of twilight, Ibrahim Traoré reflected on the journey. He had faced enemies on many fronts, had endured the burden of leadership in times of national hardship. Yet nothing had been as profound, as intimate, as shaping, as the protection and empowerment of his daughter. She had not only survived, she had flourished, becoming a force that transcended fear and cruelty. The girl, gazing at the stars that stretched across the Sahel sky, understood that she had been given more than survival. She had been given a purpose, a voice, and a platform to transform darkness into light. Her journey from isolation and torment to resilience and inspiration was complete. Yet its effects continued to ripple outward, touching lives she would never see, inspiring courage in hearts that had long forgotten it. And as the night deepened, a quiet truth settled over them both. The world could try to break a child, to silence a voice, to manipulate the powerless. But courage, love, and integrity could not be destroyed. The daughter of Ibrahim Traoré had endured the unendurable, faced the orchestrated cruelty of those who sought to wound her father, and emerged not only unbroken but radiant, a living testament to the power of resilience, the importance of truth, and the enduring strength of human spirit. The nation had witnessed something extraordinary. The child who had once been silenced now led by example, illuminating the path for others to rise, to speak, to resist. And in that illumination, a question lingered, not as a challenge, but as a promise. Could the courage of one spark the awakening of many? The answer, whispered through classrooms, homes and markets, was already being written in the lives transformed, the systems reformed, and the hope that refused to fade. The story concluded not with applause, but with quiet reverence. It concluded with the understanding that the smallest acts of courage could ripple across generations, that the protection of innocence could reshape society, and that a father's love, coupled with a child's resilience, could awaken a nation to its potential. The girl had not only survived the cruelty of others, she had transformed it, turning pain into power, suffering into inspiration, and injustice into the foundation for change. And as the night sky stretched endlessly over Burkina Faso, shimmering with stars and possibility, it became clear that this was more than a story of bullying, more than a story of survival. It was a story of hope, of transformation, and of the enduring truth that courage, when met with love and action, could light the darkest of paths.